to introduce to you Representative Jamie Grant from the Florida House of Representatives, District 64. He's a part of the founding team of CareSync and currently serves as the company's Senior Solutions Architect. He earned his Bachelor of Business Administration from Auburn University and is a recovering attorney with a law degree from the University College of Law in Tampa, Florida. In addition to his responsibilities at CareSync, he represents the Tampa Bay in the Florida House of Representatives. Please help me welcome Representative Jamie Grant.
War Eagle.
War Eagle. I brought a timer so I don't get in trouble again with Kelly this year.
He's coming.
By a show of hands, while they're pulling that up, how many of y'all were here last year or remember me talking last year? How many of y'all stayed awake for half of it? Okay, good. So we're gonna touch on minimum viable government 2.0. For those of you who were here last year, and you'll notice a little bit of a theme, we're gonna touch on a couple of the things that we touched on last year, but take a little bit of a different perspective as we get through it. So I tried to do my darndest to make sure that if it was good and you liked it last year, we repeated it. And if it wasn't, Kelly made me keep it in there. But for those of you who don't know me, I do live in Tampa. I do have kind of an interesting look on innovation, and we'll talk about that as we get into the slides. But what I'd like to do is try and make sure that we leave time so that you get to ask any of the questions that you might be hesitant to ask in public but really want to know the answer to from the intersection of politics, tech, what I go through personally, kind of in these two roles. So I like to remind everybody that we live in the fastest and most dynamic economy in the history of mankind. Right? So never before have businesses gone from concept to idea to insane valuations faster than they did before. And so before you ask, most of the stuff in here is pictures. I know we might have some Alabama fans in here. Words, math, numbers get a little tricky. And so it will be picture heavy. But my side note, my favorite pastime is walking by somebody in an Alabama hat asking them what year they graduated. Good morning to you too. So, the graph on the left, and I always make these available at the end, so the best way to get me is James Grant FL. I'll make sure Kelly has the slides. So some of this I know may be difficult to read as we go through it, but if you would like the slides after, please don't hesitate to ask. But the average company lifespan on the S&P index from 1960 to 2014 went from 56 years to 15. Right, so 15 years isn't old enough as a company to get a driver's license. It can put you on the S&P 500. That number continues to shrink. And so when we think about what we're dealing with today, I'd encourage us to remember how fast that economy is moving, but some things don't actually ever change. So I love it when my parents, who are in their 70s, and amazing, and we'll talk about my mom in a little bit, like to say to my nieces and nephews, well, these smartphones are making you antisocial. It's like, yeah, that was your commute, Mom. My mom is not that old, don't laugh. What hasn't changed is our consumption of information, right? So from the point at which we were going on trains and crowded in and reading whatever newspaper of the day, we were consuming information because we wanted to either know things, be conversational about things, but we wanted to sound smart. It hasn't changed, it's just the device on which we get it and how we get it. And so we looked at last year what life in 2016 in Internet Minute looks like. And so what I did this year was go ahead and pull some of the same things, but actually look at the growth rate, which to me was kind of interesting when you start doing the growth rates to look at some of it. But emails, 156 million emails sent a minute. It's only a growth rate of 4%, right? 150 million a minute last year. Surprisingly enough, Google's up 45% year over year. Tinder, they did not pull back on, but Bumble makes an appearance, so we made some jokes about that last year. 152,000 swipes on a dating app in a minute. Right, so when we ask ourselves, what were they doing? They might have been reading the classifieds. What are we doing? We're publishing content, we're digesting content, and for all sorts of different reasons. So when you think about 81,000 Netflix hours consumed every minute in this country, radically transforming the publishing content industry. And then the other one that was fascinating on sales, up 30%. When you look at Sam's Club, when you look at Walmart and you look at Amazon over the last decade, market cap, you see that one of them radically transformed their business. The other has basically maintained their business. Amazon's growth rate of $265,000, well, Amazon doing $265,000 in sales a minute. Think about that, right? We talk about growth rate. That's up 30% from what they were doing last year. I don't know about y'all. I would love to have a business that was doing $265,000 a minute in top line revenue. And I mentioned kind of wearing two hats, and we introduced, and yes, I'm a representative. I usually lie about that in public and tell people all sorts of fun stories about what I do, but I make my living in the tech sector. So I'm the co-founder of a healthcare services company. We have had kind of an interesting run over the last 6 years. If anybody ever wants to talk to me about the levels of insanity it takes to go from concept to co-founder to sludging through, I'm happy to sit down and have that conversation. It's not easy, but it's rewarding. The thing that keeps us going, though, right, is two things. Number one, just about every startup that dies of suicide, not homicide. Somebody gave up. Somebody quit. Somebody said it's too much. Somebody said I can't figure out how to get it done. Most everybody that succeeds in the tech space has at multiple times been corporately suicidal. You've sat around a room, you've said, I don't know how we're going to make payroll, I don't know how we're going to deal with this, I don't know how we're going to deal with that, it's just too much, why don't we move on, we have this other idea. The ones that succeed, typically, were able to overcome the corporate suicidal thoughts and say, how do we press on, how do we go? But at the heart of it is the recognition that if you don't innovate, you become extinct. Right? So in the innovative community, somebody is always trying to displace us, somebody is always trying to turn us into what I call a dinosaur, somebody wants to gobble us up. Innovate or die. Today I will get in my car and I will drive, I don't know how many hours, east to Tallahassee, and I'll walk through those doors at some point where the rule is innovate and die. If you push the envelope too much, if you are too provocative, if you would like to be too disruptive, there are lots of special interests and a ton of money that would like to take you out. And so it is kind of this interesting paradigm and context to kind of balance between those two. And for those of you who remember, last year we talked about that paradigm in the sense of operationalizing government. So in 30 seconds, for those of you who weren't here last year, we talked about the fact that businesses have long ago figured out how to operationalize, that government is a ton of siloed fiefdoms, that there are a ton of entrenched industries and stakeholders who don't want change, who don't want competition, who don't want things disrupted. And so their entire existence is to make sure that progress and efficiencies don't happen. We talked about the most egregious example of it, and it's the Department of Children and Families here in the state of Florida, where we have had multiple foster children placed in the home with registered sex offenders because databases can't communicate, and nobody in the Department of Children and Families and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement said this kid should not be at that address with that person, right? So this year I want to take a little bit of a different spin, but some things remain the same. The principle of the drinking well. Anybody who was here last year want to tell us what the principle of the drinking well was? Good morning to you too. I love participating crowds. Y'all are the best. The drinking well doesn't change, right? So when I talk about the principle of the drinking well, my grandmother used to say when things would come up, she was one of the smartest women I've ever met, smartest people that ever lived. But Mamie used to say, look, if you get just a little bit of sewage in the drinking well, just a little bit, it's not the drinking well anymore. It's now becoming a septic tank. And so I love a couple of these Clayton Christensen quotes, but the first one, often even more perplexing, however, is when these problems arise in the mind of the same person. When the right decision for the long term makes no sense for the short term. And we're going to focus on that one today when we get into some of the policy stuff that we're talking about that affects the tech community. But when the right thing for the long term conflicts with the right thing in the short term. Difficult to process, right? And then the second thing, and I think this is probably as salient as ever today in American politics, as divisive as it is, as ugly as it is, and as unproductive as it is. But it's easier to hold on to our principles 100% of the time than it is 98% of the time. As soon as we allow a compromise on what is a core principle of doing business, of serving in office, or with our families, we've made it a whole lot easier to erode from 98 to 97 to 92, and we wake up one day and we're 50% of the time holding on to our principles. And so the reason that matters when we talk about free enterprise today, and we talk about commerce, and we talk about public policy, and we talk about what the threats to the modern entrepreneur are when it comes to public policy, there's a reason that markets matter. We get more of it, we get it better, and we get it faster, and we get it cheaper when markets work. Right? So Steve and I were talking back there about a company in Tampa, based out of Tampa, doing some really fascinating stuff, but government funded in a really unique way. And one of the things I said to Steve was, I'm most fascinated to see how procurement changes. The cost of the widget changes when there's actual competition, right? So I know that you cannot read the fine print on the graph on the left, but those are things moving adjusted to the rate of inflation. Things like software, things like television, things like household furnishings, things like clothing, things that we are all buying more efficiently are getting better and faster and cheaper, and that graph is moving down and to the right, which as a consumer is a good thing for us. Things like healthcare, things like college tuition, textbooks, childcare, medical care, things that are heavily subsidized where there's often not an actual free market are getting much more expensive for us. Almost all of the inflation we're experiencing as a country is tied to those four things. To the bottom right, and I laugh, our table had some fun last night and had a lively discussion, but I made a comment that I was impressed that this 19-year-old at our table, Carson, who, if y'all get a chance to meet Carson, he will make you feel dumb in about 3 seconds, because he's doing more at 19 than I've done in my whole life. But we made the joke and we said, you know, if you do that, you'll end up being Blockbuster. I was impressed that he knew what Blockbuster was. So impressed that I threw Kodak out and then I stumped him. Right, but if we think about being Blockbuster, we think about being Kodak, both businesses made fundamental mistakes with massive market share, with massive amounts of influence. They said, I'm immune from competition. This other thing is a fad. I don't have to adapt. I don't have to innovate. And now a 19-year-old that can program robots and teaching kids all over the States is what's Kodak. Digital cameras are my favorite, though, because I never get rid of that when I speak on it. The graph at the top right is worldwide digital cameras and Apple iPhone units sold. It's a couple of years old. I always keep this slide in because Netflix will become this one day, I'm sure, history would suggest. But digital cameras are my favorite, right? Because we all laughed at Kodak. We should simultaneously laugh at all the digital camera makers, right? Who said, silly Kodak, digital cameras aren't a fad. Until Apple said, yeah, but I need you to make one and put it in my phone. That's how a digital camera works now. And so you had one dinosaur, Kodak, get eaten by the Canons of the world that were making digital cameras. And now you have folks like Jabil in Tampa Bay, companies all over the state that are doing the hardware, software, and manufacturing work to put a digital camera inside of an iPhone, to the point that we no longer would even... Does anybody in here have a digital camera? I don't mean to embarrass you, but okay. You're a photographer. I mean, that makes sense. For the rest of you, they make these things. They're also telephones, calculators. They do a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know why you'd have a digital camera, but I'm sure you have a lovely explanation. Point is, the dinosaurs will always be eaten. And if we in the innovative community don't understand that somebody's chasing us to try and make us irrelevant, we're missing the boat. So, I talked about this last year. Anybody want to talk about the Beverly Grant rule?
Yes.
Not all at once. Okay, just kidding. So when we talk about innovation, and I'll touch on this because last year we talked about it in the context, again, of operationalizing government. What does it look like to have an API-based strategy or an interoperability-based strategy across multiple silos inside of an enterprise system called Your Government in Florida that you fund? This year we're going to talk about it coming from the other side, but the Beverly Grant rule is still relevant. By the time Beverly Grant has heard about it, 72-year-old saint of a lady that she is, it is no longer innovative. It is not disruptive. It has happened, and it is pervasive. So when mom says, what is this Uber thing? And it's still technically illegal in the state of Florida and a lot of jurisdictions, a rub we're going to touch on here in a little bit. That's a problem from a public policy perspective, but we need to understand that at that point market adoption has happened. It's darn near saturated when Beverly knows what it is. When Beverly says, what is Airbnb and should I rent the top floor of the house out? You break out into cold sweats, you explain to her what Airbnb is, but you understand that we're no longer talking about a startup, we're no longer talking about disruption, we're watching it pervade through our society. And so we ask ourselves, what is that, right? How do you replicate that? And what do you call that? And really, at its core, it's free enterprise at work. Right? So where somebody can come to a market and say, I have an idea I can commercialize, and we'll touch on the Airbnb guys in a second, but when somebody can come to a market and say, I have an idea, I want to put this thing in the stream of commerce, my goods, my service, my time, my labor, whatever it is, and I want to get paid for it. I don't care if I get paid in cash, cabbage, or chickens. I want to be rewarded for my labor, my good, my service. When that can happen, unmitigated, success stories happen. Airbnb is a fantastic example of a couple guys who were broke trying to figure out how to pay bills. They had no idea they were onto what they were onto. And so the question we're going to ask ourselves today when we look at these innovative concepts, one of the questions, because I like to say that a lot, the question we're going to ask, there's lots of questions. You have to recite them back at the end. And as lively as you are, I'm sure you'll spit out like 2 of them. But my job is to wake you up for the rest of the conference. The smart people come later. They talk about more intense things. I'm just supposed to make sure you don't fall asleep at 8:30 in the morning. COGS. How many of us calculate it in our business? Okay? Go back to this innovator's paradigm, right? My real world business, I better know what CAC is. I better know what COGS are. But COGS means something entirely different when we talk about government. It's the cost of government sludge. That was a polite way of saying what I wanted to say. Stupid was what I was going to say. I don't know what you people were thinking. But how much does regulation cost? How much do these well-intentioned, often, things cost us in the stream of commerce? How much do they hamper the modern-day entrepreneur? How much do they stop growth? How much do they hurt our communities? Sometimes in the name of doing good. And the answer to that is greater than Russia's GDP. Just let that sink in for a second. We spend more in the cost of regulation than Russia's GDP. I know that's tough to read. The green bar in the middle is $1.902 trillion that we spend in the cost of regulation. All of those blue bars to the right are countries you've heard of: Italy, Brazil, Russia, Australia. $1.902 trillion that we spend in regulations in this country are greater than the individual GDP of each of those countries.
And what's the first bar?
The first bar is China, which ought to scare all of us. Half of that's owning our debt. So when we look at contextualizing the $12 billion, George Mason University did a study. And put another way, they found that during that time, from 1980 to 2012, the economy would have been 25% larger without unnecessary regulations. The economy would have grown by at least 4 trillion, or the economy grew by at least 4 trillion less over that period of time because of regulation. Right? So all of us can think of reasons why regulation is good. We say, when we look at Airbnb, a chapter we had this year in the legislative session, a chapter we will have next year in the legislative session. It will probably take us 4 years to wrestle with the simple concept of, if you own a home, can you commercialize a room or your house free from government having to give you permission to do so? That graph, let me see if I can figure out, I think it's on here somewhere. No, I'm not going to get crazy because I'll probably break it. Graph on the left, Airbnb's market cap. Airbnb's at the top. Right below it is Marriott. Don't know if you've heard of them. They're a little startup from the 1800s. Starwood, Wyndham, Expedia, HomeAway. Point is, Airbnb is not a fad. It's now valued at more than the Marriott chain. It was born, I think, in 2009. A couple of guys said, how do we pay rent? What if we put a couple air mattresses in our apartment and we cook people breakfast? Will they pay us? And a couple people paid them $80. And they grew and grew and grew and grew. All right, so when we look at 2009, they go to market. Presidential inauguration, I think, is kind of a fun thing to look at when we think about how many Airbnb bookings there were. In 2009, 200. This past year, 15,000. There are only 31,000 hotel rooms in the district. There were half as many Airbnb bookings as there are hotels in the district. Fascinatingly enough, and I'm going to make up this statistic because it'll sound credible, and it's definitely wrong. But the takeaway is this. An immense number of people are using Airbnb when they're relocating professionally to figure out what neighborhood they want to live in. So it was greater than, I think, 10% of all Airbnb bookings, or something. Again, don't hold me to the statistic. Just stick with it and run. But fascinating how many people were using this thing called Airbnb to figure out where they want to live. Right? So they would relocate. If I was to relocate to Pensacola and I don't know where to live, I'd go find Airbnbs in 5 different neighborhoods. I'd live in that Airbnb for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, figure out what traffic was like, what school was like, all those different things, and then figure out where I want to buy a house. But try before I buy. Fantastic concept that a couple of broke guys in the valley probably had no thought would ever happen, but they're growing to that rate. Here's the thing though, it's not just Airbnb, it's professions. And it's people. So when we have to wrestle with the question is, what's the purpose of regulation? People will walk into the Florida legislature, people will walk in legislatures all over the country and they'll say, we have to regulate this short-term vacation rental thing, bad things are going to happen. True. True. I'm pretty sure the first car didn't work properly. I'm pretty sure Orville and Wilbur took a while to get in the air. My question is, would we still be in horses and buggies if the backbone of this country was built on, we can't innovate, something bad might happen? And the answer to that, in my opinion, is categorically no. We've harnessed that innovation. We've acknowledged that the entrepreneur can go out and might face significant financial or even physical threats or challenges or hardships, but if they can succeed, take that product to market and be able to reap those benefits. I'd ask you, could we have modern day aspirin if the FDA of today existed then? Likely not. What would our society be like? But one of the things that isn't being talked about enough in our everyday lives, and one of the things that personally offends me, is occupational licensure. So I've put just 3 examples up here, but the picture on the left is hair braiders. And there was a woman who immigrated from this country. It's a pretty well-read article at this point from one of the New York publications 3-4 years ago. But a woman had immigrated legally to the United States of America. She had immigrated legally to the United States of America. She said, I want to go live in the freest and most prosperous society in the history of mankind. She made her living, she paid her bills, she supported her family in her village in Africa by doing hair braiding. Immigrates legally to the United States of America, the freest and most prosperous place on the history of mankind, a place that has created more innovation than anything in modern history, certainly. She shows up, and how do you think she wants to support her family? Hair braiding. She starts braiding in a village, neighborhood. Moms, kids, they're paying her to braid hair. She, in the freest and most prosperous society in the history of mankind, is supporting her family until a government regulator shows up. Says, ma'am, can I see your license? Because in the state of Florida, as one example, and she wasn't here, in the state of Florida, we have 366 of these. You had to have government permission to braid hair. So you had to have a requisite number of hours, let's say 50 in the state she was in, to make an average number for something like hair braiding when you look across the country, and spend thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to go to school to have a government bureaucrat say, yes, ma'am, you in fact do know how to do the thing you've been doing for 30 years to support your family. And I don't mean to, most of you know me, I don't really, I don't often have a filter. This is the most filtered version of you you're going to get, of me you're going to get. How arrogant is government in America to tell a woman who immigrated from Africa that the government bureaucrat knows more about African hair braiding than the woman who came from Africa? Right. Who now needs to go to school to take out loans to be able to support her family. Okay? It's offensive. We have 366 of them in the state of Florida. I'll touch on 2 examples specifically here in the state of Florida. Geologists. Do we have any geologists in the room? There's like 19 in the state, so the chances are low. Okay, good. So, all of this falls in a bucket that we would kind of sum up as deregulation in the public policy space, right? Geologists in the state of Florida have to have 2 licenses, okay? One is their individual license. But if Kelly and I both have our individual geology license and we want to open a geology business, we then have to have a firm license. Okay, we have to go to government individually and say, I'm a geologist. She goes, gets her ticket that says, I'm a geologist. Pays her extortion fee every year. And then when we want to start a business, we have to say, hey, by the way, our business is also a geologist. And then we pay our extortion fee. And then, ta-da, we're allowed to do the thing that we have a degree or experience doing. So we thought, geez, what if you just eliminate one of them? What if you say that Kelly and Jamie can go into business, and if the business is made up exclusively of licensed geologists, then you don't need another extortion ticket, and you don't have to come to government to ask that. And of all people, who do you think went crazy? The Geology Board. Okay? For every one of these professions, there is an association. The rule of association exists. Continue to be relevant. They can't fund themselves to do the regulation because, again, there's like 19 of them. And so they come and say, government, give us more money from somebody else to ensure that we get to have this association, this job, whatever it may be. Right? So the actual profession that we were trying to send money back to was being told by an association they trust, this is bad. This is going to hurt your business. We can't let all these other people come in. And so, lo and behold, you still have to have 2 geology licenses in the state of Florida. Architecture, this one was funny. I am a retired lawyer, recovered lawyer. 12 steps sober, took the program. Never going to do it again, those people are crazy. But architects walked into my office when I was trying to deregulate a bunch of things at once in a kind of an omnibus package that you'd hear about, a lot of different professions. And they walked in and they said, you can't do this, Florida's different. I said, okay, talk to me. I said, well, in Florida, we have the beaches, we have soft sand, we have limestone, all these things that are true, right? And what was at issue here was that a private company had bamboozled the legislature at some point to insert their name specifically into statute, to say that any out-of-state architecture firm had to apply and provide work product for review to this company, who would then make the decision whether or not the architecture firm could do business in the state of Florida, or the architect could do business in the state of Florida. Guess who the board of reviewers was made up of? Florida architects. Right? Guess how much it costs? Somebody participate for the love of all that's... I don't get up this early, so somebody open their mouth. Guess how much the review of work product cost just to see if you were allowed to come into Florida?
I'll take a dollar.
$7,500, who was it? Stand up. What's your name? What? Dirk? If you had a superpower, what would it be?
Not having to sleep.
Good, I like it. Dirk was correct. $7,500. Just to say, here's my work product, am I allowed to come to Florida to do business? And the people reviewing it were your prospective competition. It's insanity. And it's happening every day in all forms of government at the state and federal level. This year, I have scars on my back from something I took up that I thought, gee, this will be fun. Right? So I've been after this deregulation thing for a while, and people say, what about lawyers? And I'm like, blow it up. I don't want the bar. I think somebody should be an apprentice. They should be able to go work for a lawyer, pass a test, and go. Let me step back for a second. The architecture thing, fascinating. When I started drilling down into it, I made the parallel, and that's why these 2 slides come together. But at this time in the morning, connections don't really happen up here so much. That's why we have pictures to remind me. The architects take one national test. Right? So all of this talk about the Florida architect being so different because they have to deal with different things, from the licensure perspective, that Florida architect took the exact same test as somebody who wanted to come from Wisconsin, California, Alabama, Mississippi, or Utah. So that begs the question, why does the test matter? Right? Either the test is the end-all be-all, which brings us to the practice of law. So my colleagues would say, well, you want to deregulate everything but the law. No, I want to seriously deregulate the law, because I think it's crazy. So I took on the law of wills this year. It is literally older than the Republic. It has not been touched since 1677. And if, what's your name? Yeah, you, don't look away.
Jessica.
Jessica?
Yes.
All right. So Jessica has a sheet. I just picked on you because you're either doodling to stay awake or you're taking notes. But she has a piece of paper in front of her. Jessica could put a will on that piece of paper that would in fact be valid to convey everything she owns. Might go through contests and litigation and that kind of thing, but that would be a legal will according to the law of wills. But we also have something called a self-proving will. And I'm giving you some CLE credits for any of you lawyers in the room because it'll make sense in a second. But we also have this thing called a self-proving will, which says I signed it and I had 2 witnesses sign that I signed. Okay? They're not signing saying Jamie meant to convey everything in here that he, like, they're not signing that the will is true, that it was my intent. They're just saying I'm not saying, I'm sane, I'm not crazy, debatable, and that I did in fact sign it. Okay, that's it. Now, any of you changed your life insurance with a digital signature? We got one back there. 2, 3, all right, we got some honest people in the room. It's like peer pressure. People start going, yeah, fine, I'll tell the truth. Bought a house, transferred title. Right? All of these things are happening by electronic signature. So we had a Y Combinator company I had a Y Combinator company approach me. To my knowledge, we're the only Y Combinator company in the state of Florida, based in Miami, and they wanted to take electronic wills to market. 54% of most demographics don't have a will when they die, other than what statute says will happen. In minority communities and poor communities, it's even worse. So let's make something accessible. Better, faster, cheaper. The only thing that hampered this company's growth was the Florida legislature. Florida statute. So we tried to say, hey, electronic notarization, telepresence, recording, all those things seem like a credible, reliable way to say, yes, Jamie did in fact want to give these things away. What do you think what does REPTILE stand for? Real Estate, Probate, Property, and Trust Lawyers in the state of Florida said?
No.
Hell no. They came up with all these stories. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. Till you point at them and you say, aren't you a probate lawyer? For those of you who don't know what probate is, that's what happens to a will when somebody dies. It's the process of going through it. There's probate and there's probate litigation. There's a whole section of this group that are probate litigators. They make their living litigating wills on napkins. God forbid we have a process that's better, faster, and cheaper for the consumer to ensure that the average American or the average Floridian can update their will when they get divorced, when they get married, when they have kids, all those things that happen in life, to ensure that probate goes smoothly when they pass away one day. But probate lawyers can't be displaced. What they don't understand is the fact that competition actually makes their services more valuable and makes them better. Right? So anybody see the IMF, Christine Lagarde, last week, basically, the head of the IMF saying that cryptocurrency threatens the modern financial institution. So 20 years ago, bank tellers were worried that ATMs were going to displace them. There were more bank tellers after ATMs than before. Now the entire bank is in some regards on the chop block as a dinosaur. So how does modern American finance respond to the fact that cryptocurrency or the ability for any of us to digitally exchange currency happen? So we talked about Airbnb, we talked about wills, a couple of the next chapters that I believe are coming. I just touched on whether it's Bitcoin or any other form of cryptocurrency. When you think about what blockchain is actually going to do to the way that we transact across all layers, it's fascinating, makes my head hurt, pretend to understand half of it, probably understand 12% of it. But it's real and it's coming, so the question is, how does government deal with it? Do we step up and do we say, whoa, 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 whoa? Not allowed. Because some entrenched stakeholder wants to use government to ensure that they don't actually get competed with, to deny us, the consumer, better, faster, cheaper, and more of it. This Volvo truck I put in there, it's not actually autonomous, but it's kind of an interesting thing, and it touches on why we regulate and what the entrepreneur faces. And so this Volvo truck actually stops on a dime. They say that. I thought, yeah, that's funny, that's clickbait. If you go Google Tech Insider or Volvo truck stocking, that truck, like pretty close to stops on a dime. How do you think they figured that out? Who said that? Are you an engineer?
No.
Okay, that's an engineer's answer. The actual way they figured that out was hitting lots of cars. But I like where you were going. They hit lots of cars, right? I mean, we've all heard the joke, I forget which one of the blue-collar comedy guys it is, but the shark suit, right? Like, how do you test that? There's lots of things that have been put into the stream of commerce that you go, how in the world did that ever get to consumers? Reliable enough that more than one was sold because it works. Lots of them didn't work. And so I show the Volvo truck not only because it was kind of cool, but it is, in some regards, a parallel to one of the next chapters that's coming, and it's autonomous. So the first version, autonomous freight, how do we deal with that? We fund roads, and when I say we as taxpayers fund roads, money that goes to Tallahassee to fund roads. How much does autonomous freight impact our need to build new roads? And so where will government get involved and say, we want to slow down speed to market of autonomous freight, we want to increase the cost of developing autonomous technology? All of those things come back to that $1.9 trillion that is greater than Russia's GDP. You with me? All right, at least three of you are. The automobile. Right, so I talk about autonomous. I think one of the most fascinating things to think about is the car, even the consumer's car. Tuition rates have stayed the same. Florida universities, we're actually keeping them the same, but here's how we're doing it. We're taking your tax money on the back end and subsidizing the university so they keep their costs to the consumer lower. Question is, how many of those 366 professions have a dedicated program at a university or a college, and how much are we spending to let people go to a school, to apply for a license by having that degree? Let's say this. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, didn't have a degree. Bobby Jones was a lawyer, didn't have a degree. There's a number of them. We didn't need degrees. This country was built on small business and entrepreneurs and government staying out of the way, saying that if I, as a maybe perhaps in a different world, young, talented, intelligent person could latch on to somebody as an apprentice and say, you know this trade, this craft, you're better, you're smarter, I want to learn from you, and then eventually open up my own business, eventually hang my own shingle. That happened for generations. That was our growth as a country. But we've slowly let the drinking well become the septic tank by saying it's okay to put some well-intended regulations in place, all while absolutely crushing the modern entrepreneur, because it's scary enough to start your own business. Right? It's terrifying. And all you have around you are doubters. I don't know, how many of you have started, startup, cliche, but startup? We've got a handful. How many of you, stand up for me real quick. We're going to end with this. Stand up for me if you have started a startup. Okay. I want you, first of all, round of applause. I want you to stay standing if your entire family thought your business was a great idea. I want you to stay standing if the bank said, sure, here's a line of credit. Didn't take long, did it? My point is this, it's hard enough to be an entrepreneur in America. There's enough challenges. What we ought to be doing as an innovative community is making sure that there isn't a single, solitary, extra hurdle to dreamers who will stand up and say, I can make a better mousetrap, and here's how I'm going to get there. Good news, our path forward. Courage and principles. If we'll stick to the principle of the drinking well, if we'll remember that markets work, if we'll remember as innovators and disruptors that we just want government to stay away from us and let us build, create, and sell in the market, then we'll be fine. Here's the good news. From 1970 until today, Arthur Brooks gave a TED Talk on this. If you haven't watched it, if I could make you, I would. It's fantastic. But we hear so much bad news. We hear so much divisive, ugly stuff. This Arthur Brooks TED Talk on, it's really the power of capitalism, but it talks about global poverty. The percentage of people from 1970 until about a year ago that lived on less than $1 a day shrunk 80% around the world. What's happening is that extreme poverty on the top left of this chart down and to the right, good thing. Basic education up and to the right, literacy up and to the right, democracy up and to the right, vaccination up and to the right, and child mortality down and to the right. Those are all signs of progress. They're all good things. The question is, what path will we choose, right? So if you're in Kenya, did you wait for government to come up with some sort of thing, or did you figure out that mobile banking on a cell phone could allow you to exchange cash instead of cabbage and chickens? You want to look somewhere? Look at what the continent of Africa and certain countries, Kenya specifically, are experiencing, where people are coming up with ways to solve what seem like third world or prehistoric conditions, to say, how can we just exchange finances in the stream of commerce and what that does for an economy? Cartoon on the left says, instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe by continuing our slow decline into obsolescence. Half the boardrooms in this country. Most of the executives I deal with in my legislative capacity are what I would politely call risk averse, and in an unfiltered way would call a coward. They've worked in an institution for years and years and years, sometimes decades, or in an industry for decades, and they finally hit the pinnacle. They have a $500,000 a year job, and their only job description is don't screw up. Said no innovator ever. Said nobody who moved an institution forward faster to serve its constituents better, ever. And so it's the same slide I ended up with last year, the same map I ended up last year. We talked at the beginning that the average lifespan of an S&P company in 1950 was 56 years. And today it's 15. That graph on the right is mapping the Fortune 500 companies as of last year. We've got a couple of small dots in Florida. We've got nothing in the panorama. This room can change that. Right? Is Niels here? I don't know Niels from Adam, but he spoke last night and he did a fantastic job talking about all of the different assets we have in this room, all of the different things we can do. And Kelly, the good news is I'm only going like 2 minutes over. He went like 25. But he was fantastic. Question is, at what point, this is probably the last time I'm invited back, but if I was ever invited back, at what point does that graph change? At what point have we said that we're going to put bigger and more blue on the peninsula that we love? And at what point have we attained critical mass where thought leaders from the finance community and the innovation community and the military community have come together to harness all of the amazing assets that this coast has to paint the coast blue? And so my challenge to each of you is to remember that that doesn't happen overnight. I will close with this, and I was talking with a few folks before about this, and the notion that it's tough to get funding here and there's not a lot of institutional capital and all those other things. I don't say this from a braggadocious way. I say this from an encouragement way. Our company has now raised approximately $60 million since 2011. Our burn rate's crazy, so don't get too impressed. We've raised $60 million based in headquartered in Tampa, Florida. For probably 3 years, we were told, you're too legitimate, we can't fund you here, but if you'll relocate, we'll fund you. That was Tampa. That was 3 years ago. Guess what nobody's saying in Tampa right now? It only took a few wins. We're proud to have played a very tiny part of it, to be one chapter in that story. But we did our part. We focused on our business and we said, if we can grow, nobody else will be told you can't do it here. And right now, probably in this room, but in our community, there are people who are told you can't do that in Northwest Florida. Well, why not? So some of you will step up and change that paradigm. I look forward to hearing your story. I appreciate most of you for staying awake. You in the back, not so much. I'm just kidding. Nobody's actually asleep back there before somebody thinks I'm picking on somebody. But I do appreciate you putting up with me, and I will take a couple questions if there are any. But thank y'all. Not all at once.